Hello again. It's so good to have you back on board. Our journey towards building more effective climate adaptation plans is well on its way. Last week, we learned about different adaptation options for agriculture and ways to prioritize amongst them. But as we continue, we are faced with growing challenges. Finding sufficient resources, creating more effective climate governance, and coordinating our efforts. Now, we have reached an island where we will discover how institutional coordination, budgeting, and financing ensure effective implementation and upscaling of adaptation options. Now, institutional coordination plays a role at every step of the NAP process. Coordination is driven by policies, institutions, and governance arrangements. Decision makers use these three prongs to engage with all stakeholders throughout the planning process. Ultimately, they ensure that climate change adaptation priorities are fully integrated and aligned with other national and sectoral development processes. For example, how can we align adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and why should we? Chhor, Director for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDP, can shed some light on this.
The connection between disaster risk reduction and climate change, first and foremost, is the reality that 80 to 90% of disasters worldwide are climate related. Hurricanes, floods, etc. And when we tackle these problems through the kind of programmatic interventions we do, these interventions are very similar and often the same. For instance, from a climate change adaptation perspective, if we plant mangroves, it would do the same from a disaster risk reduction perspective. From a climate change perspective, we establish early warning systems in terms of hurricanes. You do the same when it comes to disaster risk reduction, adaptation in agricultural sector, etc. A big difference, of course, remains that the other 10% to 20% of disasters are geophysical hazards, such as earthquakes, and that, of course, is where a large difference lies. But climate change and disaster risk reduction are very, very closely related, and our program interventions quite often exactly the same.
Institutional coordination relates to connecting agriculture with other sectors. But those of you who are not already familiar with institutional coordination may be left wondering, well, how does this really work? Here is a possible institutional flow for addressing the agriculture sectors in the formulation and implementation of NAPs. Think about a country which wants to build a national adaptation plan. This country also wants to make sure that its agriculture sector is well integrated into this plan. Where will it start? As you remember from week 2, the first step is to ensure that there is a clear mandate in place to steer the NAP process. Usually, in the case of climate change adaptation, this mandate is given to the Ministry of Environment or Planning, or sometimes to the President or Prime Minister's office. The mandated agency will usually oversee the work of a national multi-sectoral committee or working group. This committee is then responsible for coordination across several sectors and scales and ensuring the involvement of agriculture representatives. Next, to get into the details, the different departments and ministries, such as those of crops or livestock, produce section plans. Remember that in many cases, agricultural subsectors are dealt with by different ministries. In the end, all need to be brought into the planning process, which takes time and good management. Leadership will also be important. Focal points for climate change adaptation or NAPs could be established here to help the process and gather in sectoral working groups. Ideally, the national level mechanism would be replicated at the subnational or even district levels, and after this, the actual planning can start. You may have noticed that the planning process takes account of many different views and inputs. This requires research, stakeholder meetings, communication plans, training events, and so on. The goals at this point are that sectoral priorities are identified and accordingly, sectoral and local adaptation plans are defined. These can then feed back into a comprehensive, nationally endorsed adaptation plan or other planning documents and processes. Now, did this seem easy? You can already tell that in practice, this process can be challenging and will vary from one country to another depending on the national context. There are many institutional barriers in the way of adaptation planning, which might obstruct the coordination flow. As more and more countries engage in these processes, we learn where the main bottlenecks are and what are some of the solutions. Let's learn more on this point from Rohini Kohli from UNDP.
The barriers for intersectoral integration are faced by many countries, not just developing countries, because it requires a lot of coordination between different ministries, for example, and each ministry has normally got a very defined role it needs to play vis-a-vis a certain topic. I mean, for example, a Ministry of Agriculture may need to work very specifically on agricultural productivity. But the challenge for adaptation planning is they will have to factor in the risk projections for the crops, but not only for crops, also for other intersectoral issues such as irrigation and water supply. So in many ways, the coordination between ministries, and we are talking about ministries, but we also mean at different levels. It's coordination between departments, it's also coordination between government and say civil society or community-based organizations that work on adaptation. There are a lot of these sorts of coordination issues that come up because they are traditionally not working together for a more scaled up response to adaptation. And this is a barrier because the work has been happening at different levels. It's either happening at a project level, or it's also happening, or the work is happening at the national level where there might be lots more coordination obstacles.
Thank you, Rohini. Another barrier to coordination is that the national mandates on climate change are often fragmented. For example, there can be a false separation between climate change adaptation and mitigation mandates. Rohini has something to tell us about how UNDP supports countries to address these challenges.
There isn't a clear separation between the mitigation and adaptation elements of the institutional coordination in some countries. However, with the signing of the Paris Agreement and the momentum of the National Adaptation Plans process in countries are now gradually realizing that there are lots of links between the adaptation aspects that need to be managed of climate change, but there are also some links between adaptation and mitigation. So in some countries there are climate change units within the ministries of environment, many of whom are separated into adaptation and mitigation units, and I think we are seeing these adaptation units are slowly are coming up, which are new. But I expect that with the National Adaptation Plan process further gaining ground, most of the countries will designate a national mandate for their national institutions to carry out planning, especially around adaptation. A lot of the projects that have been implemented by UNDP, for example, have strengthened a lot of local level coordination and implementation of adaptation initiatives on the ground. I can take also the example of Bhutan, for example, where there are programs specially funded by the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, which have been working with the district councils and the provincial councils to really improve the process of the vulnerability assessments that are done in a collaborative fashion between the different departments of ministries, but these are done at the local level. So at the local level, there is a great deal of coordination that is going on between different departments through these district bodies. And we will probably start to see a lot more of this happening at the national level in most countries. When it comes to livelihoods or water management or projects on topics such as those, they're involving the local district institutions, which are by definition a coordination structure, because they are not one department from one ministry or other. They're actually a conglomeration of different departments that work together.
We just presented to you some of the barriers to coordination and possible solutions to overcoming them. Now, These plans, policies, and institutional arrangements need to be translated into action. This is where we start looking into options for financing adaptation. Let's hear from Astrid Augustini, FAO Senior Natural Resources Officer and Climate Finance Expert.
Here it's critical to recognize the important role of domestic budgets and domestic investment. It is not just the international financing flows that are critical to bring about transformational change. We know that domestic budgets are a key source of public finance and a much, much greater source of public finance for agricultural development than we have from the international flows. So it's important on the one hand to mainstream climate change into domestic budgeting processes, so to know which parts of public budgets go towards climate change expenditure, and particularly to integrate climate change aspect into investment appraisal that happens at the national level, so that national investments are clearly undertaken with a view towards long-term climate change impacts and long-term climate change realities.
Thank you, Astrid. Indeed, in many countries, national budgets are the most significant source of domestic finance for adaptation measures. They are also the most important means of translating climate priorities into action. Climate budgeting is about mainstreaming climate change actions into all aspects of the budget cycle and building stronger systems for tracking domestic climate finance. It involves a series of stages, each with distinct entry points. The first step is to track existing expenditures to see how climate action is currently funded. In Nepal, for instance, UNDP is enhancing climate change budget coding and climate adaptation expenditure tracking capacities in the livestock and agricultural ministries. It is also working to align the country's medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal planning system to its climate policy goals and targets. The lecture notes this week explore the process in detail and include practical tools and examples. We have covered some of the basics of coordination and budgeting when planning for NAPs. There are three main things to remember. First, institutional coordination is a key part of the NAP process. It ensures that the adaptation priorities of all relevant stakeholders are integrated and aligned with other national priorities. Second, institutional coordination may be challenging in practice, but there are ways to address barriers and capacity gaps and incentivize institutions and political actors to be engaged. And last but not the least, budgeting is the step in the planning process that makes implementation possible. See you in the next video, where we will explore the different kinds of climate finance to implement and scale up adaptation actions and innovative ways to mix them up.